One of the best things about making videos on classic franchises is that even if one entry doesn't live up to the success of its predecessor, the third game 9 out of 10 times manages to redeem the series, and in most cases become the best entry in the initial trilogy. And thankfully, Castlevania III Dracula's Curse belongs on that list. As the title of the video suggests, Castlevania III is a lot like Super Mario Bros. 3. It not only returns to the initial formula seen in the first game, but expands it, creating, in my opinion, one of the best action platformers on the NES. From what I've gathered, Castlevania III is very well regarded in the larger retro gaming space. It's remembered as being very difficult. In fact, I'll get this out of the way right now, but this game is hard. Like classic NES hard. I feel like when most people talk about classic Castlevania, they tend to specifically focus on Super Castlevania IV. And, can you blame them? Castlevania III released at the tail end of the NES's life cycle, since by the time it reached North America, the SNES was already out in Japan. And it's not like developers stopped making games for it. Go look at classic Mega Man. However, Castlevania III would be the last entry directed by series creator Hitoshi Akamatsu, as he would disappear from the video game industry under mysterious circumstances, which is a damn shame. But not to give too much away, I think it created a very strong finale. So if that's the case, how did Castlevania III serve as the culmination of the NES trilogy? Let's find out. Well, to start, Castlevania III released in 1989 in Japan and 1990 in North America. Akamatsu once again returns to serve as director, deciding to return to the formula established in Castlevania I, given the lukewarm reception of Simon's Quest. Although that statement is entirely hearsay on my part, I think that's the only explanation given that we're back to how things worked before. However, Castlevania III wouldn't just be Castlevania I again, because in terms of this game's production quality, the team over at Konami really went out of their way to not only make it familiar to fans who played the original, but make so many improvements, ultimately leading to this game's success. Castlevania III is one of the best looking games on the NES. All of the backgrounds and sprite work still look incredible, a relief given the ugliness of Simon's Quest. Another improvement made was the creation of the special VR06 coprocessor chip, which to my understanding added extra weights to the system sound channels, allowing for a more dynamic soundtrack. Though, in an ironic twist, the North American cartridge couldn't support the chip, so as a result the North American version had to replace the VR06 chip with the standard MMC5 chip, forcing the composer to remix the entire soundtrack for the international version. As for the story, we once again return into the shoes of a Belmont, but instead of following Simon Belmont, Castlevania III is a prequel having us take control of Trevor Belmont, a distant ancestor of Simon during the Belmont's first battle against Dracula. In 1476, Count Dracula, after spending centuries in hiding, amassing his forces, is ready to begin his attack against humanity. One by one, the armies of Europe fall to the power of Dracula, and in this time of desperation, the church turns to Trevor Belmont, the current head of the Belmont clan and wielder of the vampire killer. Though the Belmonts were exiled for their superhuman abilities, Trevor accepts this mission to honor his family's legacy and hunt the knight. Another basic setup to another basic story. Instead of following Simon Belmont again, Castlevania III is a prequel beginning a series staple following a different Belmont in their fight against Dracula, in turn making the JoJo connection more prominent. Trevor Belmont, in terms of his personality and appearance, is strikingly similar to Simon, with his signature scar being his most defining characteristic. According to the Castlevania timeline, Trevor is canonically the first Belmont to battle Dracula, and while technically speaking Leon may be the founder of the Belmont clan, he never fought the Count, since his story dealt with Dracula's origin. Still, in the 300 years since Leon's time, the Belmonts gathered a reputation of being fearsome vampire hunters, ultimately leading to their exile by the church. However, by the time of Dracula's attack, Trevor accepts the call from the church and decides to battle Dracula, showing his heroic nature similar to Simon. While I'm in the middle of discussing Trevor, there was another Castlevania game titled Castlevania Legends that attempted to create an origin starring a character named Sonia Belmont. It was released on the Game Boy and isn't considered canon because it has this weird twist where it's revealed in the ending that Sonia and Alucard had a son named Trevor. And going off that statement, that would make Dracula Trevor's grandfather. And if that's the case then, is Alucard's boss battle Trevor collecting his child support? Trevor isn't my favorite Belmont, that honor goes to Simon. However, unlike Simon, Trevor does come across allies who aid him on his journey. And finally, I figured now would be a good time to mention that Castlevania III was used as the inspiration for the animated Netflix series. And just to let everyone know, I've never watched the show, but maybe I'll check it out. From what I've heard, the first 2 seasons are the best, and after that, seasons 3 and 4 were more of a mixed bag. Castlevania III definitely feels like it gets special treatment by Konami, given all the supplementary material surrounding it, but the only real way to find out is to begin Castlevania III. Let me start by saying it's good to be back. Castlevania III returns to the original formula of Castlevania I, but ups the ante in terms of its difficulty and level design. Like previously, you'll be navigating levels divided into blocks and face a boss at the end. A lot of the same mechanics like respawning at the beginning of a block if you lose a life do make a return. So if anything, Castlevania III is kind of the true sequel to Castlevania I. Trevor controls the exact same as Simon previously. He still has the trademark Belmont walk, which I'm glad is still there, but like Simon, he still can't control his jump in midair, and the knockback is still as annoying as previously. More so this time around because Castlevania III has more examples of tight platforming and difficult enemy placement. So if anything, Trevor is Simon with a different sprite. All of the items from Castlevania I do make a reappearance, and they function the exact same way as previously. Back in my Castlevania I video, I made a point ranking each sub-weapon based on how useful they were. And in the context of Castlevania III, my ranking still hasn't changed. I know that might sound bad because once again, the Holy Water is still the same OP weapon that can melt bosses. Doubly so if you have it upgraded to level 3. But going from Castlevania II where sub-weapons felt extremely nerfed, the point where many of them weren't very useful unless it was the Golden Knife or the Sacred Flame, to then returning to the OP Holy Water, which honestly felt really good because it's really satisfying getting to melt a lot of the late game bosses. For the 2 playthroughs I recorded, I always kept the Holy Water no matter what because no other sub-weapon, not the dagger, not the stopwatch, could compete. In fact, the stopwatch got severely nerfed this time around. You can't use it in boss fights anymore, as it won't freeze bosses like previously. Which is pretty disappointing, but a change that made the stopwatch better balanced or ruined depending on your point of view. However, I'll give Castlevania III a lot of credit. It puts more care into the placement of sub-weapons, putting them in places where they can be useful, like putting a throwing axe in the beginning of level 3 to help deal with the owls, or a stopwatch on the pirate ship to counter annoying enemy placement. Mind you, that's only what was carried over from Castlevania I, because Castlevania III does what all great sequels do, it builds upon what came previously. To make my first point, which connects to the next topic, Castlevania III has much more variety in terms of its level design and locations. Instead of being set entirely in Castlevania, Castlevania III takes a page out of Simon's Quest, where most of the game is about Trevor's journey to Castlevania and defeating Dracula's minions along the way. A huge benefit from this is that levels can have unique identities and set pieces and not feel the strain of the castle setting. Don't get me wrong, I love the atmosphere of the first game, but traversing a haunted pirate ship or navigating an underground maze makes repeated playthroughs more memorable. One of the best additions made to Castlevania III is the inclusion of branching pathways leading to different levels and characters, making Castlevania III even better on repeated playthroughs. In one playthrough, you can take the upper path leading to the main entrance of Castlevania, or take the lower path entering Castlevania via an underground passage. I always appreciate when games offer the player the freedom to decide how their journey progresses, because even that sprinkle of non-linearity can make any game more fun than it needs to be. But the real reason why branching pathways exist is to find one of the 3 new playable characters. The bosses have seen improvements, with many of them being multi-phase and offering different challenges. Sometimes Castlevania III likes reusing certain bosses like the Cyclops and Evil Spirit, but the strategy used to beat them requires understanding the boss's attack patterns and knowing when to deal damage. For the Cyclops, his only weak point is his eye, but there are platforms you can use to be able to reach him. Otherwise, you have to bait his hammer attack and avoid his charge. Then there are the returning bosses like the Mummy and Frankenstein. However, a problem all the bosses have is they can be cheesed with holy water or by sitting in a corner. Every boss is more challenging compared to Castlevania I, but when you can beat bosses doing this, then I have to ask if it's a problem with the game or a matter of skill. I do like the ones introduced, but part of me does miss the simplicity of Castlevania I. Castlevania III, in the grand scheme of things, is the epitome of classic NES fun. When you look at games that define the NES like Super Mario Bros. 3, Castlevania III, and The Legend of Zelda, these games demonstrated the best of the NES's library, becoming classics still fondly remembered today. Being able to play as 4 characters a la Mario 2 USA and have the level design fit each of the characters shows how well designed the overall game is. Whichever character is your favorite depends on your playstyle. Trevor is great for fighting, Grant for his speed, Sypha for her magic, and Alucard for his bat form. Castlevania III has such a great cast of characters, and I always found myself changing in between them for certain levels. If you have Sypha's ice magic and use it on water, you'll temporarily freeze it, allowing you to avoid the water physics for a brief period, showing great attention to detail. I like how in the clock tower after you rescue Grant, the game has you backtrack your way through the tower, except this time, you have Grant who can crawl past enemies, and you can skip the entire last session by falling down. In my opinion, that's how you do backtracking the right way. Give the player a new ability that makes the return trip easier. Finally, Alucard's bat form makes this section of level 7 go by very quickly. There are still moments of classic Castlevania difficulty. I don't like the Stairway of Death in the Red Tower, and I hate those annoying gargoyle enemies who are a bigger and more aggressive Medusa head. Depending on what path you decide to choose, will affect how you enter Castlevania, with the game having an appropriate difficulty spike. Although like Castlevania 1, Castlevania 3 does reward you for remembering the level design. It all comes down to using the right character at the right moment. Entering Dracula's castle through Sypha's path will have you enter through the castle's outer walls. Meanwhile, Alucard's path has you sneak in underground. However, beyond the first block, the remaining stages are the same, with the second being a great callback to the opening of Castlevania 1. Except this time, you fight Death, making his appearance finally, and going down just as easy as always. Seriously, only use the holy water. The next stage, I won't lie, is Red Tower 2.0. It has another Stairway of Death pretty much to the T, and I'm pretty sure it exists for players who took Alucard's path. The boss at the end is a doppelganger or whatever character you are, but he's cheesy if you sit in a corner and spam holy water or lightning magic. Beginning the final stage, you have to navigate a quick side-scrolling section and a couple of rooms of enemies, finally platforming over a couple of pendulums, leading to the final boss. Heading up the stairs and entering Dracula's chamber, the final boss is a gauntlet with 3 phases. It should be noted that if you lose all your health, you'll begin in the section before the final boss, having to do everything all over again. And if that sounds bad, if you get a game over, you'll begin at the beginning of the stage, so don't let that happen. In his first phase, Dracula will teleport around the room trying to trap you with 2 pillars and using a 3rd pillar to deal damage before teleporting again. The strategy I like to employ is to keep just enough distance between Trevor and Dracula. That way I can deal 2 hits of damage, then move before the fire pillar hits me. You never want to get close to Dracula because the closer you are, the more narrow the fire pillars are. And at most, you can only get 2 hits in before the last pillar comes up. So in all honesty, being greedy in the first phase isn't worth it. His second phase on the other hand is much easier, and if you're like me, spam holy water and wait for Dracula to fly low enough to be able to do damage. The phases that vomit blood is where you'll have to target, and you can manipulate Dracula's flight pattern by standing just before the corner and waiting for the right moment. However, Dracula's first 2 phases are a warm-up to his 3rd and final phase, easily being his most difficult. Throughout the fight, 2 platforms will rise from the ground, and your job is to ride them to Dracula's head where his weak point is, while avoiding the lasers. On a first playthrough, the lasers might seem difficult to avoid, but all you have to do is bait them by standing still and they'll miss you every single time, interchangeably dealing damage to Dracula's head, eventually defeating him. Before celebrating, however, make sure you don't fall into a pit after dealing the final blow, because otherwise the orb won't spawn in until the platforms return to their original spot. Afterwards, Trevor and his ally watch Castlevania collapse to the ground. So yeah, that was Castlevania III Dracula's Curse. After playing Simon's Quest, it felt great being able to return to the original formula while at the same time witnessing the improvements made that led Castlevania III to becoming one of the best games on the NES. Like I said in the beginning of the video, this would be Akamatsu's last Castlevania game, and for what it's worth, he went out with a bang. If you're gonna play Castlevania 3 nowadays, be ready for the challenge this game throws at you, but once you master it, I guarantee you'll hop right back in to do another playthrough. It's always a pleasure seeing the amount of detail and passion that went into games like Castlevania 3, ultimately leading to the series jumping into the 16-bit with Super Castlevania 4, which will be the next game I'll be covering. So with that being said, all I can say is, thank you for watching, and take care.